A man boards a British train in 1868 with a suitcase full of explosives. He looks completely calm. This isn't new for him, exactly, just never on a train, never with this much riding on it. 3 years earlier, a blast outside Stockholm killed his own brother. That tragedy somehow leads him here, and this trip leads somewhere even stranger. Comment your city below, then let's rewind to where it all started. That fire didn't come out of nowhere. Nitroglycerin had been trouble since the day it was born. An Italian chemist named Ascanio Sobrero first made it back in 1847, mixing glycerin with nitric and sulfuric acid. He got a yellow, oily liquid and almost immediately regretted it. A tiny sample blew up in his own lab and scarred his face. Sobrero was so horrified by what he'd created that he begged people not to use it. He called it too dangerous for any practical purpose. Nobody listened. Here's the problem with nitroglycerin. It doesn't need much to set it off. A hard knock. A sudden jolt. Even a shift in temperature. Carry a bottle of it on a bumpy road and you might not make it to your destination. Store it somewhere too warm and it can go off with zero warning. It's roughly 10 times more powerful than gunpowder, which made it incredibly attractive to miners, builders, and engineers who wanted to blast through rock faster. But that same power made it a nightmare to transport, store, or even look at wrong. Alfred Nobel's father, Emmanuel, had been fascinated by explosives for years. He'd run a factory in St. Petersburg making weapons and mines for the Russian military, and he passed that fascination straight down to his sons. Alfred grew up surrounded by chemistry, tutored privately, fluent in several languages by his teens. He wasn't some outsider stumbling into explosives. This was the family business, passed down like a trade. By the early 1860s, the Nobel family had set up shop back in Sweden, trying to figure out how to make nitroglycerin usable on an industrial scale. They weren't the only ones chasing this. Chemists and engineers across Europe wanted a more powerful blasting agent than gunpowder, especially for tunnels, canals, and railways that gunpowder alone couldn't cut through fast enough. Whoever solved the stability problem first stood to make a fortune. Whoever failed stood to lose a lot more than money. People did fail, and they failed badly. Reports of nitroglycerin accidents piled up across the continent through the 1860s. Warehouses vanished in seconds. Ships carrying crates of it never made it to port. Workers loading barrels onto wagons were killed instantly, with no time to even understand what had happened. The stuff earned a reputation as something almost cursed useful. Yes, but the kind of useful that came soaked in blood. The Nobel family's own lab, the one that killed Emil, was part of this same race. They were trying to find a way to make nitroglycerin behave to slow it down just enough that it wouldn't detonate from an accidental bump, but would still explode reliably when you actually wanted it to. That's a strange, narrow needle to thread. You need something violent enough to blast through solid granite, but calm enough to survive a wagon ride over rough terrain. After Emil's death, Swedish authorities didn't let Nobel rebuild in the same spot. Nobody wanted a nitroglycerin factory sitting near a city again. So Alfred moved his operation onto a barge, floating it out on Lake Mlaren, far from homes and workers who might get caught in the next blast. Picture that for a second, a man testing one of the most unstable substances on Earth from a boat, just so if it exploded, it wouldn't take a neighborhood down with it. Grief didn't stop him. If anything, it sharpened his focus. Alfred wasn't just trying to build a better product anymore. He was trying to prove that his brother's death meant something, that it led somewhere other than more funerals. He kept mixing, kept testing, kept looking for a way to trap that violence in something stable enough to carry in your hand. He tried a few approaches that didn't work. Diluting the nitroglycerin reduced its explosive power too much to be useful. Storing it in sealed metal containers didn't stop it from reacting to shock. He needed something that could physically hold the liquid in place, soak it up, almost without dulling its punch. That meant finding the right material, something porous enough to absorb the nitroglycerin, but stable enough not to react with it. Around this time, Nobel noticed something odd happening with the packing material used to ship his nitroglycerin containers. A soft, chalky, absorbent earth called kieselguhr, basically the fossilized remains of tiny ancient algae, was sometimes packed around the bottles to cushion them during transport. When a container leaked, the kieselguhr soaked the liquid right up, and it stayed stable. No shock detonation, no mystery explosions, just a damp, safe-looking paste sitting where a puddle of pure danger should have been. That observation would end up changing everything. But at this point, Nobel didn't know it yet. He was still grieving, still experimenting, still working from a floating lab because solid ground wasn't safe enough to trust. The breakthrough was close. He just hadn't connected the dots. Nobel didn't stumble onto the full answer overnight. He took that observation about the leaking container and turned it into an actual experiment. He started mixing nitroglycerin directly into kieselguhr on purpose, testing different ratios, trying to find the sweet spot between stability and power. Too much kieselguhr, and the mixture lost its punch. Too little, and it stayed just as dangerous as the raw liquid. He kept adjusting, kept testing, kept getting closer. What he landed on was roughly 3 parts nitroglycerin to 1 part kieselguhr. The result was a thick, moldable paste, something you could actually pick up, shape, and pack into a hole without worrying it might go off in your hands. You could drop it. You could jostle it around on a wagon. You could even light it on fire in small amounts, and it would just burn, not explode. That last part mattered more than people realize. Fire was everywhere on a worksite: torches, lanterns, sparks from tools. A blasting material that could survive an open flame was a massive leap forward. One catch remained. This new stable paste needed something to actually set it off when you wanted it to. A match or a fuse alone wouldn't cut it anymore, because the whole point was making the stuff resistant to accidental ignition. Nobel had already been working on this piece of the puzzle a couple years earlier, back in 1865, when he invented the blasting cap. The blasting cap was its own small stroke of genius. Instead of trying to light the explosive directly, Nobel used a tiny charge of a different, more sensitive explosive mercury fulminate packed into a small metal cap. You'd insert that cap into the dynamite, attach a fuse, and light the fuse from a safe distance. The fuse would trigger the cap would trigger the dynamite, and the whole chain would go off in a controlled, predictable way. It sounds simple now, but at the time, this was the missing link nobody else had figured out. Put those two inventions together, the stabilized nitroglycerin paste and the blasting cap, and you get dynamite. Nobel patented it in 1867, and he gave it a name that came from the Greek word for power. He wasn't being modest about what he'd built. He knew exactly what this thing could do. Quick pause here. If you're finding this as wild as I did researching it, hit subscribe now, because we're about to get into how this invention spread across the entire world, and it gets even crazier from here. Now, having a great invention and having people trust it are two very different things. Nitroglycerin's reputation was so bad by this point that plenty of people assumed dynamite was just the same nightmare with a new name slapped on it. Nobel needed to prove, publicly and dramatically, that this was something different. Words weren't going to do that. He needed a demonstration. So, in 1868, Nobel did something that sounds almost unbelievable today. He packed roughly 20 pounds of dynamite into a suitcase and boarded a British train. Think about that for a second. A man nervous enough about explosives to build his lab on a floating barge was now sitting in a passenger car with a suitcase full of the stuff resting near his feet. If British authorities had caught him, he risked serious prison time. This wasn't a stunt for attention. He was traveling to sell his invention to buyers who needed to see it work with their own eyes. He wasn't reckless about it, either. That's the whole point of the story. Dynamite, unlike raw nitroglycerin, could survive exactly this kind of situation, a bumpy train ride. Sudden stops, the shaking and jostling of ordinary travel without going off. Nobel was essentially staking his life on his own invention's safety, because he needed to prove that this new explosive could be transported without turning every wagon and railcar into a potential coffin. The trip ended without incident, and it became part of Dynamite's origin story almost as much as the invention itself. Word spread. Mining companies, railway builders, and construction firms across Europe started paying attention. Here was an explosive that was still incredibly powerful, but that you could actually store, ship, and handle without rolling the dice every single time. Within just a few years, demand for dynamite exploded, in every sense of the word. Nobel started building factories, not just in Sweden but across Europe and eventually the United States. He wasn't just an inventor anymore. He was becoming an industrialist, sitting on top of a business that supplied one of the most valuable commodities in the world, the ability to blast through rock. Faster and safer than anyone had ever managed before. But here's the thing about creating something this powerful. Once it's out in the world, you don't get to control what people do with it. Nobel built dynamite to move mountains, cut tunnels, and open up canals. He never intended it to become anything else. What happened next would test exactly how far that intention could hold. For a while, dynamite did exactly what Nobel hoped it would. It tore through the world's biggest engineering problems like they were nothing. Mountains that had blocked railroads for decades suddenly had tunnels punched straight through them. Rivers that flooded valleys got redirected. The Gotthard Tunnel through the Swiss Alps, the Corinth Canal in Greece, mining operations across the American West, all of it moved faster because of dynamite. Construction that used to take a generation now took a few years. Workers could blast through solid granite in an afternoon instead of chipping away with hand tools for weeks. Mining changed the most. Before dynamite, miners relied on black powder, which was weaker and much slower to work with. Dynamite let mining companies go deeper, faster, and cheaper. Coal, silver, copper, gold extraction rates climbed everywhere dynamite showed up. Entire boomtowns in the American West owed their existence to it. Places that would have taken decades to develop got mined out in a fraction of the time, for better or worse. Nobel's factories couldn't keep up with demand. He opened new plants across Europe, then across the Atlantic. By the 1870s and 1880s, dynamite wasn't just an invention anymore, it was infrastructure. It built roads, it built canals, it built the modern industrial world, brick by literal blasted brick. Nobel became one of the wealthiest men in Europe, holding hundreds of patents and running factories in dozens of countries. But power like that doesn't stay contained to construction sites. The same qualities that made dynamite perfect for tunneling also made it perfect for something else entirely: destruction on purpose, aimed at people instead of rock. By the 1880s, dynamite had found its way into a very different kind of headline. Anarchist and revolutionary movements across Europe and the United States started using it as a weapon. It was cheap, it was portable, and unlike older explosives, you didn't need a military background to use it effectively. A single stick could level a room. That made it terrifyingly accessible to anyone with a grudge and a plan. Some of the most notorious violence of the era involved dynamite directly. In Chicago in 1886, a bomb thrown during a labor rally at Haymarket Square killed several police officers and bystanders, triggering a wave of fear about anarchist violence across the country. In Russia, revolutionary groups used dynamite in assassination attempts against government officials and eventually the Tsar himself. In city after city, dynamite bombings became a grim fixture of political violence, labor disputes, and revolutionary movements. Newspapers picked up on this fast, and they weren't shy about linking Nobel's name to the carnage. He'd built his fortune on an invention meant to move mountains and build railways, and now that same invention was showing up in bombing after bombing, wrapped around headlines about anarchists and assassins. The gap between what Nobel intended and what people actually did with his creation kept getting wider, and there was nothing he could do to close it. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Nobel wasn't naive about explosives. He'd spent his entire career around them. He understood their power better than almost anyone alive. But there's a difference between understanding what something can do and controlling what people choose to do with it once you hand it to the world. Dynamite didn't care whether it was blasting a tunnel or a train station. It just did what explosives do. The intention belonged entirely to whoever lit the fuse. Governments started reacting too. Some countries tightened regulations around who could buy or transport dynamite. Police forces began treating unexplained explosions as potential acts of terrorism rather than accidents. A shift in mindset that basically didn't exist before dynamite made bombings this easy to pull off. The word dynamiter started showing up in newspapers as its own kind of criminal label, separate from bomber or assassin, its own dedicated category of fear. Meanwhile, the construction side of Dynamite's story kept rolling forward, mostly untouched by any of this. Mining companies didn't stop buying it. Railway builders didn't stop using it. The industrial world had gotten dependent on dynamite's power, and that dependency wasn't going away just because a fraction of it was being used for violence instead of progress. Both stories ran side by side for years, one about tunnels and canals and economic growth, the other about bombs and fear and political unrest. For Nobel personally, this created a strange kind of split reputation. In business circles and engineering journals, he was a genius, an industrialist, a man reshaping how construction worked worldwide. In the popular press, especially after a few high-profile bombings, he was something darker, the man who'd handed the world a tool for mass violence and profited from it either way. Both versions of that reputation were true at the same time, and Nobel had to live inside that contradiction. It would only get more personal from here, when a newspaper's mistake forced him to read his own obituary and see exactly how history was already deciding to remember him. The moment came in April of 1888, and it happened almost by accident. Alfred's older brother Ludwig died of a heart attack while staying in Caen, on the French Riviera. A French newspaper caught wind of a Nobel's death and rushed to print an obituary. The only problem was, they got the wrong brother. Instead of running Ludwig's obituary, they published one for Alfred, who was very much alive at the time, sitting somewhere reading a newspaper that had just declared him dead. What he read next must have hit like a punch to the chest. The headline branded him the Merchant of Death. The text described a man who had grown wealthy by finding new ways to kill people faster and more efficiently than ever before. It didn't mention the railways. It didn't mention the tunnels, the canals, the mining towns that dynamite had helped build. It focused entirely on the darker legacy, the bombings, the assassinations, the wars that had used his invention as a weapon instead of a tool. Imagine reading your own obituary and realizing this is how the world already sees you. Not as an inventor, not as an engineer who solved a problem that had killed his own brother, as a man who profited from death on an industrial scale. That's the version of Alfred Nobel this newspaper handed back to him, in black and white, while he was still alive to read every word of it. There's no surviving record of exactly what Nobel said in the moment he read it, but the impact on him is well documented through what came next. Friends and biographers describe a man who became noticeably more withdrawn, more reflective, more troubled by questions about legacy than he'd ever been before. He was already someone prone to isolation. He never married, had few close friends, and spent much of his life moving between his factories and laboratories rather than building a personal life. But this obituary seems to have cracked something open. It forced him to confront a question most people never have to face directly. What will people say about me after I'm actually gone? This wasn't just wounded pride. Nobel had spent decades convincing himself that his work served progress, that dynamite existed to build things, not destroy them, and that the violent uses of his invention were a corruption of what he'd intended, not the point of it. The obituary told him that distinction didn't matter to history. People weren't going to remember his intentions, they were going to remember the body count. Over the next several years, Nobel started quietly reworking his will. He didn't announce it, didn't explain himself publicly, didn't try to rehabilitate his image through interviews or statements. Instead, he did something much bigger and much quieter. In 1895, just a year before his death, he signed a new will that redirected almost his entire fortune, the vast majority of it built on dynamite and armaments, into a fund that would award prizes each year to people who had done the greatest good for humanity. Physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. That last category wasn't an accident. Of everything he could have chosen to fund, Nobel specifically created a prize for peace, using money earned from explosives and weapons manufacturing. It's hard to imagine a clearer response to being called the Merchant of Death than deliberately funding an award meant to celebrate people working against war and violence. He never publicly connected the obituary to the will. He didn't have to. The timing and the content speak for themselves. Nobel died on December 10, 1896, in San Remo, Italy, largely alone, with no immediate family at his side. When his will was finally read, his own relatives were reportedly stunned. Nobody had expected him to give away this much of his fortune to strangers, funding prizes for people he'd never meet, in fields ranging far beyond explosives and industry. Some family members even contested the will, unhappy about how much money was being redirected away from the family and toward this new foundation. It took years of legal wrangling before the first Nobel Prizes were finally awarded in 1901, 5 years after his death. What's strange, and maybe fitting, is that Nobel spent his entire life building something that could tear the world apart in an instant, and he spent his final years trying to build something that might hold it together instead. He couldn't undo what dynamite had already done by the time he died. Bombings didn't stop. Wars didn't stop. But he could control what his name eventually stood for. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. Today, when people hear Nobel, they think of peace prizes and scientific breakthroughs, not explosives. That's not an accident. That's the result of one obituary, read by the one man it was supposed to be about, who decided he still had time to rewrite the ending. But here's the part that gets left out of most tellings of this story. Nobel wasn't just an explosives inventor sitting quietly in a lab. He was also, at the same time, becoming a major player in weapons manufacturing. In 1894, just 2 years before his death, he bought a company called Bofors, a Swedish iron and steel mill that had been struggling for years. He didn't buy it to make farm equipment. he redirected it into weapons production, turning Bofors into a manufacturer of cannons and military armaments. Think about the timing here for a second. This is happening in the same stretch of years when Nobel is reportedly wrestling with his legacy, rewriting his will, and planning a prize fund dedicated to peace. And at the exact same time, he's expanding into artillery manufacturing. It's not a contradiction he ever resolved publicly, and it's one biographers still argue about today. Was he trying to profit from every side of the arms race while quietly funding peace on the back end? Was Bofors just business as usual, separate in his mind from the moral weight of the Peace Prize? We don't have a clean answer, because Nobel never gave one. What we do know is what happened to Bofors after he died. The company kept manufacturing weapons well into the 20th century, supplying artillery and anti-aircraft guns that were used in major conflicts, including World War II. Bofors guns ended up on battlefields on multiple sides of that war. A company Nobel personally redirected into arms manufacturing was, decades after his death, helping equip the exact kind of large-scale industrial warfare that dynamite had helped make possible in the first place. The thread runs in an unbroken line from that 1864 lab explosion straight through to 20th century battlefields. Meanwhile, the other half of his legacy was unfolding in a completely different direction. The Nobel Prizes, funded by that same fortune, started small in 1901 and grew into arguably the most prestigious set of awards on the planet: physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine. Literature and peace handed out in Oslo instead of Stockholm at Nobel's specific request, for reasons historians still debate. Some think he distrusted Sweden's political establishment. Others think he simply saw Norway as more neutral ground for an award about avoiding war. Today, when a scientist wins a Nobel Prize in physics, nobody thinks about dynamite. When an activist or a diplomat wins the Peace Prize, nobody thinks about railway bombings or Bofors artillery. That disconnect is almost the whole point. Nobel didn't just donate money, he built something so prestigious, so widely respected, that it completely replaced his original reputation in the public imagination. Ask most people today what Nobel means, and they'll say prizes. They won't say dynamite, and they definitely won't say arms dealer. That's a strange kind of victory, if you can even call it that. Nobel spent the back half of his life essentially rebranding humanity's memory of him, using the very fortune that came from violence to fund awards celebrating human achievement and peace. And it worked. More than a century later, his name carries almost none of the weight that merchant of death obituary tried to pin on him. The prize outlived the accusation. The irony doesn't disappear just because it's quiet. Every single Nobel Peace Prize ever awarded has been funded, at least in part, by money that traces back to explosives and weapons manufacturing. The endowment that pays out those prizes each year grew from dynamite patents, arms factories, and decades of industrial explosives, sales across dozens of countries. Peace, in this specific case, is quite literally funded by war's tools. That's not a criticism exactly, it's just the actual, documented history sitting underneath one of the world's most respected institutions. Dynamite itself is mostly gone from modern use, replaced by safer and more stable explosives that don't carry the same instability risks nitroglycerin-based products always had. But its legacy split into two completely different paths the moment Nobel died, and both paths are still running today. One path built Bofors, weapons contracts, and a direct line to 20th century warfare. The other built a prize ceremony in Oslo and Stockholm every December, honoring people trying to make the world better. Same fortune. Same man. Two completely different afterlives, both still active more than 100 years later. And that split might be the truest thing anyone could say about Alfred Nobel, not that he was a hero or a villain, but that he built something powerful enough to be both at once. and spent the rest of his life trying to decide which version of himself would get remembered. One choice Nobel made near the end of his life gets left out of almost every version of this story, because it complicates the ending too much. I know what it is. I'm curious if you can guess it before I do a follow-up. Comment your best theory right answers, get a reply.